If you look at, there is a citadel, a middle town at Dholavira, and then a lower town at all other cities, which shows that there were this working class people, and then a middle class people, and then a higher class people. There was a hierarchy which existed. So there would have been a religious hierarchy, there would have been a social hierarchy, there would have been an economic hierarchy. But then how they actually interacted with each other in spite of this hierarchy is something which is not yet probably understood properly. So to be used as a kind of working for the modern day issues, to apply those solutions over here, first of all you have to understand how they actually solve their issues, which is not known. So it would be very difficult to answer that without understanding the society until the day we get a large inscription of their belief systems, and then we know to, or we read that inscription, decipher that script. It would be difficult. Gujarat, which played a major part in trade networks from the Gangetic Valley, which was a major economic center in the historic period, and then prior to that when the Harappans were in Western India itself. The coast, the ports here played a major part, which continues into the modern time. Also, even when you look at the modern times, you have some of the major ports in the country existing on these parts. So it's quite possible.
Yes.
Wants to know about how can the ancient system be used to solve modern issues, right? Well, that's a very complex question, because here also, in fact, we have talked only a very minute fragment of the ancient system. But then if you study the ancient Harappans, again, the knowledge about their lives and their systems is much less known. We do not know much of their systems. So to be used as a medicine for modern day issues and problems, I don't know how much of it, because as long as you do not understand their systems and how they dealt with their society, it's not yet fully understood. We are still in the process of understanding them, studying them. Whatever we know about them is solely from their material remains. Unfortunately, like say the Egyptian or the Mesopotamian civilization, the script is not deciphered. We do not have large inscriptions which talks about their social character, their belief systems, their contacts. Whatever we understand is only from the material remains. So unless and until we understand about their belief system, for example, some of the social evil or ill, or whichever way you call it, or good or bad of the society, religion, for example, if you look at the religious issues which we face in the modern times, we do not know how the Harappans organized their religion. We only know that they had a belief system, they had some of the materials which they worshipped. But then what were the names of these gods? What was the style of worship of them? What was a kind of social hierarchy which existed, which divided the society based on religion, is something which is not yet fully understood. And similar is the case of the economic disparities. If there was, we talked about the high economic standards of the people, but then this may not be applicable to the entire or 100% of the population of that period of time. There would have been a hierarchy which existed, which is shown by their city layout. If you look at, there is a citadel, a middle town at Dholavira, and then a lower town at all other cities, which shows that there were this working class people, and then a middle class people, and then a higher class people. There was a hierarchy which existed. So there would have been a religious hierarchy, there would have been a social hierarchy, there would have been an economic hierarchy. But then how they actually interacted with each other in spite of this hierarchy is something which is not yet probably understood properly. So to be used as a kind of working for the modern day issues, to apply those solutions over here, first of all you have to understand how they actually solve their issues, which is not known. So it would be very difficult to answer that without understanding the society until the day we get a large inscription of their belief systems, and then we know to, or we read that inscription, decipher that script. It would be difficult.
Yeah, a little bit out here, knowing our history, especially now that parts of the Indus Valley Civilization is part of Pakistan, at a time when differences are made huge among the society. It would, where people, common man, there is no hate among the common man between anybody else. There are certain leaders, certain factions who are trying to separate the common man. If we understand that we have a joint heritage, if we can be proud of our joint heritage and protect our joint heritage, realize that all of us come from the same civilization, and bring down these differences with this knowledge that is available and let rational thought come across, there would be lesser pain and probably lesser riots, probably lesser violence with people. Knowledge is important. Knowing our history is important. Knowing about the Indus Valley cities is important.
The differences which are caused in the modern times, last say 75 years, post-independence I'm talking of, or even if you take 100 years, the differences are primarily caused due to politics and religion. So if you leave these two things out, the people in the entire subcontinent, we have a common heritage, we have the common ancestors, we had common lifestyles, livelihood and cultural belief systems. It all happened only in the last 100 years maximum.
I'll come on to the next question. This is from Susan Mishra. What are the contemporary cultures in Gujarat and how did they play a role in the trading networks? Does any site in Oman have evidence of import of perishable goods?
Yes, when I say perishable goods, as I mentioned earlier, dairy products. Gujarat was right from the Harappan times, we have evidences that cattle breeding was a major activity over here, even now also, and dairy products. Gujarat and adjoining regions of Rajasthan. So this would have been we have vessels which were probably used for, like the perforated one, if it was used for kind of a milk processing, like cheese and all, these were exported also. We don't have a direct evidence of these materials being exported, but then these vessels, the perforated vessels are found even in the Omani territory also, from the Arin region, the Harappan perforated vessels, which shows that some of the people who carried them probably would have been either carrying the products from here or even using the same technology to produce materials over there. We don't have a direct evidence, but then indirect or secondary evidences are found for the dairy products. That was one part of the question. And what was the one?
What are the contemporary cultures in Gujarat and how did they play a role in trading networks?
Well, I'm not getting into the contemporary one, but then trading networks, right from Gujarat being a region in India which has the longest shoreline, and then the adjoining, when you look at the Harappans, adjoining regions of Pakistan too, with a very long shoreline coming very close to nearly 1,500 plus kilometers. Naturally, ports were a major activity over here. Even when you come to historic times, when it was, say, for example, the Mauryan times, when Ashoka was ruling, or Chandragupta Maurya, or even the Guptas were ruling in the north, in the Ganges Valley, their access to long-distance trade was through the ports, either on the east or on the western side of India. So when you want to go to the Western world, naturally they had to travel through the land, come to mostly in Gujarat, because that's the shortest from the Gangetic Valley. So come here and then send it through the sea route. So Gujarat played an active role in this ports, existence of the ports, and then marine trade right from the historic times, early historic times. Harappan times onwards, we have evidences of the existence of ports, which continues into the historic times when the Romans comes in. You have quite a lot of ports here, like right up from, say, Bharuch and modern Bharuch, or other cities along the Gujarat, which played a major part in trade networks from the Gangetic Valley, which was a major economic center in the historic period. And then prior to that, when the Harappans were in Western India itself, the coast, the ports here played a major part, which continues into the modern time. Also, even when you look at the modern times, you have some of the major ports in the country existing on these parts. So it's quite possible.
Yes. To Sahib Mitrapal, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes.
Namaskar from Kolkata. This is Shahib Mitrapal. I'm part of the Rakhaldas Banerjee Commemorations Committee here, and we try and preserve the legacy of Rakhaldas Banerjee and his archaeological achievements. Thank you very much, Professor Chandran, for a very insightful yet made suitable for a layman discussion. I have two specific points I would like you to address regarding the 30-odd Indus seals that were recovered from the Sumerian civilization, which gives us evidence regarding the interactions between the Sumerians and the Harappans. Have you had the pleasure of studying these and going into further details regarding the exact nature of these seals? And also regarding the fire worshipping cult that you mentioned in Kalibangan, have there been any comparative studies made between the origins of the Zoroastrian faith in Persia and the fire worshipping, which is an integral part of the Zoroastrian faith, and before the arrival of the Safavid dynasty and their eventual exodus to India? When we come to the Zoroastrian traditions, do we find any study that establishes the point of origin of the fire worship in Zoroastrianism with the fire worshipping cult in Kalibangan. And regarding, because you just mentioned Gujarat as a
questions, can you continue one after another? First ask one, get an answer, then ask another.
The seals in Sumeria, do we have any similar findings in Lothal? Because that is one established major port regarding the Harappan civilization. Have there been any similar findings at Lothal with regards to the items in exchange? These are my queries, ma'am. Thank you.
So let me first of all say that when you talk about the Sumerians and then the Lothal of Harappans, you're talking of two different time frames. The Sumerians comes contemporary to, the peak time of the Sumerian civilization comes contemporary to, if I understand it right, comes to almost contemporary with what we call as the pre-Harappans. That is the pre or 500 years before the Mesopotamian civilization. In those regions itself, the Mesopotamian civilization comes after the Sumerians, few hundred years. Which means if you look at the Sumerian seals and then you want to compare them with the Indian territory, you don't have a civilization which produced a seal at that point of time over here. When you come to Lothal, we are talking of say around 2500 BC, 2400 BC and slightly later. So when Lothal comes in, you have the Mesopotamian civilization, not the early what you call as the Sumerian ones, which is slightly before that. So they are of a different time frame altogether. And then the seals which you have, but then you have seals which are there in the Mesopotamian, you have what you call as the cylinder seals. You have kind of rollers which you can roll over a material, whereas the Harappans never used that kind of a seal. The typical seal of the Harappans was the cubical seal with a square front, usually square front, which you stamp onto that, made on steatite. And then contemporary to them, the Arabians, they also have the circular seals. So every region had their typical style of making seals. And then the impressions on them also varies naturally, depending on the individual beliefs. As I mentioned, until you read that, we don't know exactly whether those the depictions have any religious significance or industrial significance or craft significance. We don't know. But then we generally find an animal or a bird or some kind of a depiction with few lines written on top of that in the Harappans. Whereas when you go over to the other territories, they have their own individual depictions. There are quite a few detailed studies done on the seals, which I have not actually gone through that in detail. So to actually explain what do they, each one of them exactly depict or mean is something beyond my capacity. You have to look at, there are a few books, in fact, exclusively on Harappan seals and other seals, and then where they try to actually decipher each of these, the significance of each of these. But then the seals were different. Looking at this, and you have the presence of these Mesopotamian cylinder seals in Lothal, and then the Harappan square seals in Mesopotamia, both ways, which also shows the exchange of people or movement of people. It would have been carried by the traders along with them with their seal, and then the Harappan seals on the back side of it have a small little hole drilled into that so that you can put a string through that and probably hang it on your neck. You can carry it wherever you go. So the moment you want to authenticate your product, you can just take it out of your neck and then stamp it and then seal. Other significance, you have to look for those expertise studies on. That is one thing. And regarding fire worship, in fact, I have not done much studies on the fire worships. I only know that the Harappans worship fire probably. You have evidences of that from the Harappan context. But then about the connection of that with the Zoroastrians, and then whether they actually have anything to give and take, and then the time frames of each one of them, that has to be dealt with differently, because that's not my topic. In fact, I have not studied much about the Zoroastrians or their developments, then the connection of them with Harappans, if any. I'm sorry.
Okay, Sashank Babu, what about the trade contact between Sorath Harappans and other regional Chalcolithic cultures of Gujarat? Is there any study on their relationship?
Well, for those of others who are attending over here, let me tell you, when you talk about Harappans, you have seen in the map that it's a large territory. Starting right from, say, southern Kashmir and Punjab, Haryana, to modern times, through the entire Punjab belt and then Sindh of Pakistan, Sindh, Balochistan of Pakistan, into Rajasthan and Gujarat of India, which is a very large terrain. And then quite naturally in this terrain, when we say Harappans, we cannot assume that they were all one and the same. As in the modern times, where you have Punjabis, you have Harris, you have Sindhis, and then you have Rajasthanis, there also you have different communities, and then the Kachis, the Saurashtra people in Gujarat itself, similar kind of differences would have existed then also. So even when we try to study their inscription, that is yet another issue, because we are still not very sure. It's undeciphered. When you decipher it, we are still not very sure whether this entire community of the Harappans use the same script or the same language. There would have been variations. So Sorat Harappan in this question primarily or essentially mentions or deals with Harappans who were settled in the Sorat region. Sorat is the Saurashtra region of Gujarat. So people who were settled in the Saurashtra region in Gujarat, the Harappans over there is called as the Sorat Harappans. In short, for Saurashtra, in short, Sorat. And then similar is the case of when you come to North Gujarat, the Harappans over there, that terrain is called as the Anartha. So that's called as the Anartha. So the Anartha region had a kind of Harappans. The Sorat region, Saurashtra region had a kind of Harappans. Kutch region had a different kind of Harappans. Sindh had, which is usually considered as a classical Sindh region. It's a Mohenjo-daro region. So there were different types of Harappans, even when you call them Harappans. Like in the modern time, even when we call Indians, there is a Gujarati is different, Gujarati itself, Saurashtra is different, Kutchi is different, Sindhi is different, and then Rajasthan there are different communities, and then Punjabi, Haryanvi, everybody different. So quite naturally they had differences in style. There are slight variations depending on the climate, depending on the food habits, variations in their vessels, in their food habits quite probably, and climate is different. Quite naturally dressing would have varied. Like in the modern times, you can imagine in the modern time with so much of connectivity and movability, still we have variations. So 5,000 years back, 4,500 years back, with not much of movement of people, quite naturally the differences would have been larger. So there are quite a few differences, quite a few variations. Sorat Harappans had their own typical style, but there are few common characters. Like again in the modern case, even when we have the Rajasthani, Kutchi, Sindhi, all different, but there are certain characters which binds, which is what we call as the Indian culture. So you have a common Indian culture plus the local variations, which would have happened then also. You have a common Harappan culture. So when you look at their town layout, a similar kind of layout, when you look at some of their standardized vessel forms, and then the weights and measures probably decided by the central government, capital or the ruler, you have common features over there. Quite possible. But then local variations too, which is quite possible, quite natural, because you have climate difference, soil different. So naturally your crop patterns are different. So when the crop patterns vary, your food habits vary, your vessel shapes vary, climate varies, your dressing varies. So everything is different. So you have these different communities, and they all actually communicated with each other, traded with each other. There were certain common characters which actually control this trade, and then that is what causes their common character. So even when we say Harappan common at the school level, it's generally taught that the Harappans had common characters, which is not entirely true, because each region had its own regional characters. And accordingly, we classify them as a Sorat Hanartha Harappan, Harappan, Sindhi Harappan, and then the Punjabi Harappan, different types of Harappans. We don't even know whether they had different languages, because we don't know their language. We don't know how they spoke or what they spoke. The day we learn to decipher the script, we read them, then we can try to understand if these readings generally talk of different languages. We don't know. Until then, we don't know. But then it's quite possible that they had different languages. Just like in the modern times. आजकल भी देखो आप राजस्थान जाओ, मारवाड़ी के पास जाओ, पंजाबी के पास जाओ, के पास जाओ, कच्ची, they all talk different tongues, different languages.
Sir, what do you have to say about Mr. Stalin saying that he's given an amount for deciphering the language?
Yeah, that's about giving the amount. Well and good. I hope I find that out and get 1 million. But it's a very different. To be serious, it's a very difficult aspect, because many people have actually claimed, right from my student days, I had been reading, many people have claimed that this is deciphered. But then the problem is that claiming is one thing, but then you have to prove it. That is a different thing, which doesn't happen overnight. So even if there is a genuine claim coming up tomorrow, to prove it under different context, under different writing, and then compare it with the other contemporary writings in the Mesopotamian or other regions, and then to accept them as truth, as readable, it would take some time. But in any case, whenever it comes, that would be one of the biggest findings. Naturally, I'd been hearing right from this is Stalin talking about giving a monetary benefit. I have been hearing right from my student days that those who decipher wouldn't get a Nobel Prize. I don't know.
Yukti Datta, would you like to ask a question?
Good morning, sir. I'm Yukti from Delhi. This was an absolutely amazing session so far. I just have one question pertaining to the ones that have been asked prior. It's just a continuation in that theme itself. Given that Mesopotamian civilization at the time when I was in the early and the mature phase didn't have much resources to offer apart from the abundance of bitumen or reed in particular, and IVC in itself had a lot of natural beads and grains and metals to offer for trade, and the kind of trade exchange and remnants we find or whatever evidence we are able to garner from cuneiform. My question is that what exactly could be the nature between of the interaction of the Mesopotamian as well as the IVC? Were they codependent in nature, or the fact that one civilization was acting like a satellite to the another? Is there another possibility that we as students of archaeology are not able to comprehend it so far? That's it. Thank you.
Well, that is something which I also used to wonder, like the materials when you look at, when you have a trade, it should be bilateral, not a unilateral trade. So when things used to go from here, for which you have sufficient evidence of the non-perishable things which survives over there. But then when you look back, what did they bring back is a question which my students also used to ask, that you don't have quantity wise or quality wise, when you look at the materials which you have bought back, we don't have much evidence of whatever came from there. Which is why most experts generally, whichever I have read, generally says that because a trade cannot be unilateral, which shows that most probably the materials would have been perishable materials which doesn't survive, which is why we cannot see them. So it would have been mostly edible things like oils, perfumes, dates from the Middle East, and then other animal products which would have come here. We don't know. None of them survives. Actually, I don't know exactly, because I haven't seen many things which actually can be on par with the materials which we send from here. But then ऐसा कोई trade survive नहीं होता है. But from my personal experience which I have seen, I used to tell my students the same thing also. This had not been studied much, which I was interested in studying, but it never happened, is raw materials which could come from, especially in the Arab regions. Mesopotamia is a region where you do not have much of a raw material. It's most of a river valley, Euphrates, Tigris valley terrain. There are not much of natural resources over there. So they are dependent mostly on imports. They imported their copper. So the Mesopotamians actually depended mostly for their supplies with the Arab nations, like say copper. This is a copper age culture. There is absolutely no copper ore source in the Mesopotamian region. So their entire copper supply, the ore supply, used to come from the Omani terrain, where you have huge hills of copper. I personally believe that even the Harappans, when you look at the quantity of copper which they needed, the only copper source which they had is on the Aravalli hills, the Khetri mines on the southern coast.
Right.
Yeah, that is much less, which may not be sufficient enough for the entire need of the Harappans. Whereas when these boats were coming in every year, hundreds of such boats coming in, and not only that, yet another point which I used to tell my students is that a boat cannot actually cross the sea empty, because it's very unstable then. It will take the wind. It can be unstable. It should have a certain amount of load in that, where that makes the boat steady, is what seagoers say, which means you should have a certain amount of load in that. So the copper ore, if they fill the boat with the copper ores, or even flint, Oman is very full of flint, which was again another necessity of the Harappans. The only source of flint is in the Rohri hills, in the context, which again might not have been sufficient. So some of this flint, some of this copper, if it is analyzed, you have to chemically analyze the copper, whether with the components of that, you break it down and then see whether it's a Khetri copper or whether it's a Omani copper, which was brought down from there. So some of these non-perishable things probably could have been imported from there into the Harappans. But then other than that, most of the other materials are perishable, should be perishable. Otherwise, we should have seen that. We don't see them here. As I mentioned, it cannot be that you just only sell things, you don't buy anything back. Is not possible in a trade. It doesn't happen in business. So things would have come mostly perishable. Animal products, edible products, which doesn't survive actually, because they don't have anything other than such permanent materials, long-standing, long-surviving materials, which could be actually sent over here. They were more of a consumer society, the Mesopotamians. They used to buy things mostly from the Arab regions, the Egyptian regions, and then utilize them. Whatever sent was mostly the edible copper.
Okay, we'll go to our next question. Sneha Parthasarthi. Any specific reason for the shape of the large urn, specifically the way it tapers down towards the bottom?
I suppose I briefly told about that while speaking there. This is basically a transport vessel. And in transport vessels, especially water transport, say marine transport, you are taking it in a boat. So you cannot put a normal normal port in a boat and then carry it. The slightest of the winds, and then the boat actually tilts left or right, and then this will fall down and your liquid gets spoiled, you're wasted. So for transportation, not only in the Harappan times, even when you come to the Roman times, say beginning of Christian era, when the Roman wines were imported, what you call as the amphora, the Roman amphora, they all have this tapering pointed base at the bottom, which is actually what is fitted in the boats. You have a large wooden platform into which holes are cut, and then you fit this into that hole, the base of these vessels into that hole. So much so that even this tilts a little bit, even if you have rough weather when you are out in the sea, and then it actually tilts, this doesn't fall off. So because you have fitted it into the hole, you have a big platform on which a hole is cut, and the pointed base actually fits into that. So little bit of movement this way, that way, doesn't cause it to fall off. So that your liquids, whatever you are carrying, it could be oil, it could be perfume, it could be wine, it could be any liquid consignment, can be carried much more safer when you carry it in a transport vessel. So these pointed based vessels are all transport vessels. This was utilized for the Roman wines when they come in. The amphora, for example, you look at the Roman amphoras, they all have pointed bases. The torpedo jars, they have pointed bases. And then these kinds of transport vessel used in the Harappan times, they also have pointed bases. Exclusively used for transporting in the boat. You have a wooden platform, as I said, where you cut holes and then fit this pointed base into that, so that out in the sea, even in rough weather, they are steady. You don't lose your consignment by falling off of the vessels.